Welcome to tonight's talk on the sacrament of holy matrimony. We don't have a lot of time tonight because we've got something at the end, so I'm going to get started. The overview is, first we're going to talk about the characteristics of the sacrament, then the fun part, the saying I do part, and the meanings behind all of that. We're going to discuss a couple of the places where marriage is talked about in the Bible, including one of my favorite passages in the entire Bible. We're going to discuss some technicalities, then the role of the family, and sanctifying grace. Those last two are going to be pretty quick as we go through this. But before we start, I just want to make a quick caveat. This is the sacrament that everybody thinks they know about, because we all have examples of marriage in our lives. Either we're married, or we know people that are married, or our parents were married, or somebody was married. But included in all of those marriages that we've seen, that we take our cue from as to what a marriage is, what the sacrament of marriage is, are some less than ideal marriages as well. And for tonight, we can all recognize that there are some less than ideal marriages. Actually, all of them are less than ideal because we're all fallen. We're all imperfect. So there is no perfect marriage, but some are better than others. For tonight, we want to concentrate on the ideal marriage. And even if we don't belong to an ideal marriage, focusing on what the ideal is allows us to shoot for something, allows us to move forward if we're in that. So, or if you're going to be married, you know what to shoot for. So it's a good thing to know what the ideal is, even if we don't live within it at the moment. It's a good target to have, whether you're married or single. So a sacrament occurs in a church. A marriage can also happen in a courthouse. When a marriage happens in a courthouse, there is no sacrament. You haven't invited God into your marriage. There's a way to cure that, by the way. If you were married in the courthouse, you can bring that into the church. It's called convalidation. I'll mention it a little bit later on. And when that happens, when you invite God into your marriage, it means that He can pour out the grace that we need to have a good lifelong union and a healthy family. So we want to do that. So what are the characteristics of the sacrament of holy matrimony? What are the characteristics? First, free will. The first characteristic is so obvious that we tend to skip over it. We tend to skip the fact that free will is involved in getting married, but it's at the heart of the sacrament. Entering into marriage is a public declaration of, I chose this person, my free will. I chose this person freely. And out of all the people in the world, I have found the one whom my soul loves, and I have chosen them. So free will is at the heart of the sacrament. Second is love. This one is also very obvious, but we don't skip over this one. We think this is the whole thing about marriage. And it's one of the parts, but it's not everything. As I've mentioned before, I can't remember which week it was, but I've mentioned before that there are 4 words in Greek that are all translated into English as love, right? Bonus points for anybody who can mention all 4 Greek words. Agape is one. Philia. Eros. What's the last one? Actually, the first one. The one that applies to chocolate and a cute dog. Storge. Agape is, just a different way to pronounce the first one. No, it's fine. Storge. It both has a hard G. So agape, oh, that's cute. Philia, we've got a common bond. Eros, I want to hug you. And agape, that sacrificial love that God tells us to do. So affection, friendship, romance, and agape. Basically, it means we're a team, we're a partnership, we like each other, we trust each other, and we're faithful to each other. So all of those come into that characteristic. The next characteristic is permanence. And a sacramental marriage is a permanent relationship. That's where we get the till death do us part of this. It means that it's not only a free decision, but it's a bit more mature decision than I just want to hang around until things go south. I'm in this for life. I've chosen this person for life. And then last is fruitfulness. Marriage is oriented and ordained by God to move towards children. So in the very first chapter of the Bible, the very first page of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, God tells man and woman to be fruitful and multiply. And this is really important because love always seeks to create more love. And that's part of the fruitfulness of marriage. Love wants to create more love. Now, the 4 characteristics, you might think that I just, I sort of randomly picked 4 and say, oh, that's a nice poetic way to talk about love. It's not. Well, it is. But it comes from the 3 I do questions that we say at the altar, which I'll cover in detail in a little bit. But it's basically, do you come here freely? Do you promise to love and honor each other until death do you part? That's both the love and the permanence. And then will you accept children lovingly from God? So, where does the requirement of permanence come from? This comes from a couple of different places in the Bible, actually several. I'm going to hit a couple. Second page of the Bible, Genesis chapter 2, says, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the 2 of them become one body, or one flesh, depending on the translation. Now, God didn't say that man and woman should enjoy each other for as long as it's fun, until he upsets me, until I get bored or whatever. We become one flesh, we become one body. So it's not just for a while, but it's lifelong. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, there's a scene between the Pharisees and Jesus, where the Pharisees are trying to test Jesus, trying to push him a little bit. And they test him by coming up to him and saying, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And Jesus answers, have you not read that he who made them from the beginning, that's God, have you not read that God made them male and female? And said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the 2 shall become one. If it sounds like a little bit of an echo of what we just said in Genesis, because Jesus is basically quoting from Genesis. That concept is there. And then he continues and says, so they are no longer 2, but one. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. And that fancy word asunder, which we're all familiar with because it comes from this, means to rip apart. So if God has joined them, we don't have the power to pull them apart. That's going to be important as we continue here. And then the Pharisees who were challenging Jesus continue to challenge. And they came up, they continued here, and they said, why then did Moses command that we could have a certificate of divorce? Why is that? Why can't we, as they say, put her away? And Jesus came back and said that Moses did that for your hardness of heart. He did that, but it wasn't meant to be that way. It wasn't that way in the beginning, and it shouldn't be that way now. There was a point in time, go all the way back to Genesis, and we become one. Oh gosh, a piece of trivia just floated in my head, and I've got to let it out. Okay, depending on what translation you're in, we come together, we cleave together. The word cleave can mean, the word cleave is an interesting word. It can mean the opposite of itself. So you can cleave to one another and be joined, or like a cleaver, you can separate. So isn't that interesting? The word cleave can mean the opposite of itself. Now back to actually what I was talking about. Okay, so in the beginning, God says we come together, man and woman come together, and we become one flesh. But there was a point in time as God's people were slowly on their way to becoming a moral people, right? Getting ready to understand Jesus when he shows up. There was a point in time where they didn't quite have it all together yet. So when they got tired of each other, the man wanted to separate, or the woman wanted to separate. Well, actually, it was a patriarchal society back there, so it was the man that wanted to separate. And they were doing all sorts of mean things to try and separate. So Moses said, okay, I'll let you have a writ of divorce, basically. But it wasn't meant to be that way. And Jesus is here saying, okay, Moses, a man, made that little extra rule because of the hardness of your heart. But now we're in the New Testament. Now we've gotten to the point where the fullness of revelation is there. Jesus is there, and we should all be mature in our thinking morally. So we're going to go back to the way it's supposed to be, which is, no, it's a permanent thing. You got to think about it, and it's a lifelong kind of thing. Now, the commitment to permanence enhances the other characteristics. If you remember, the characteristics was free will, love, permanence, and fruitfulness. And permanence enhances the other three. If you think about free will, I've already mentioned this one, knowing that it's a permanent decision means that you go into it with a little bit more maturity. You don't go into it saying, oh, I'll do this until it's... Have you heard this from modern culture? You get married until it stops being fun and then you just find somebody else? Have you heard this from modern culture? They like to say this. That's not the way God says. We become one flesh. So the fact that it's permanent enhances that free will. It also enhances the love because, as we know, the greatest form of love is agape, which seeks the highest good for somebody, or loving someone as you love yourself, right? Love others as you love yourself. When is this any more true than in marriage? You become one. So the person whom you love is you. You become one. And when one rises, the other rises. When one falls, the other falls, which is why I don't understand sometimes, even though I've seen it, where spouses can be like, well, I want to tear the other one down so that I'm stronger. It's like, it doesn't work that way. If you tear the other one down, you go down. So if you want to be smart about it, you lift them up so that you can be lifted up. People don't quite get that, but we want to understand this. We want to understand this properly. Also, the permanence with regard to love, it means that this person knows everything about me, but they can't leave. So they're stuck with me. I can be myself. I can be completely and totally myself with at least one person on the planet, and they're there always, which is a nice thing. Going back to Genesis chapter 2, a lot of this goes back to Adam and Eve in the garden. It said, the man and his wife were both naked, yet they felt no shame. It's in Genesis chapter 2, which basically means I can be ultimately vulnerable with no fear. Because if I know that my spouse understands this permanence, I can be completely vulnerable and I know they won't bring me down, because that's not good for them either. So with at least one person on the planet, you can be ultimately vulnerable because we rise and fall together. Last thing, fruitfulness. Permanence helps the fruitfulness as well. God said, be fruitful and multiply, but God never tells us to do something that's in a chaotic manner. So which is why he ordains us to be fruitful within the permanence of a sacramental marriage. Why is that good as far as fruitfulness is concerned? Well, kids are more secure and more grounded when they know they're in a permanent household, when they know that mom and dad are there, and they feel safe and secure because of that permanent bond. So that's how permanence can help the other three. Now, going back to the I do's, remember I said I was going to go back to the three questions. This ties into the fact that the sacrament of matrimony has certain things in common with the other 6 sacraments, but has one very important thing that's different than all of the other sacraments. In common is, if you remember, sacraments are an outward sign of an inward grace that's instituted by Christ, right? We know that. But there's the one difference that Holy Matrimony has, aside from that's different than all the other sacraments, is that all the others, the minister of the sacrament is the priest. So the priest is performing the sacrament. But with matrimony, Chris, you and Cassandra performed. You guys were the ministers of the sacrament to each other. The priest was there basically as a witness and to perform other functions. But as far as the sacrament of matrimony, it was the two of you. And this is also true of any of the rest of you that were. I'm just picking on him because he's just getting used to it. So it's kind of fun. So the priest will ask 3 questions. And this is just to make sure that the mindset of the 2 ministers of the sacrament, the mindset is correct. So he asks these 3 questions. We're used to it because we've seen it in movies, we've read it, we've said I do to it if we're married. But these 3 questions are really important. The first question is, have you come here freely and without reservation to give yourselves to each other in marriage? Of the characteristics I mentioned at the beginning, which one does this tie to? Free will, right. So it's really important that God knows that each one of them are there freely and without reservation. Let's say the father of the bride happened to find out that the two of them were living together and he doesn't expect that and he's got a gun and the groom is there under penalty of death to say, I do. Is the groom free to decide yes or no? That would be an example of him, not having free will. So that's an example. The second one is, will you love and honor each other as man and wife for the rest of your lives? This one includes two. Which are the two? Love and permanence. Right. So this is a 2-for-1. So we get both of them in that question. And then the last one is, will you accept children lovingly from God and bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? That's the last one, which is fruitfulness and teaching the faith. It throws that one in. And so when we say I do to those questions, we use our free will to publicly declare that we're committing to love and to be faithful, to be steadfast and permanent, to have our love be fruitful and generate new life, and to teach the faith. Have you noticed that all of those things that I just mentioned are things that God does? He loves, he's faithful, he's steadfast, he's permanent, he's fruitful, he generates new life, and he teaches the faith. That's one of the reasons why we say that the sacrament of marriage is a visible sign of the nature and the interior life of the Trinity. It's really cool, right? So all of the sacraments have signs, right, that are visible outward signs. And if I ask you what was the visible outward sign of matrimony, you might say, well, a wedding ring, right? And yeah, to a certain extent it is. It's an outward sign of it. But the bigger outward sign is that love and that faithfulness, the steadfastness, the permanence, the fruitfulness, the generation of new life. Because that's the outward sign that we show to the world about this sacrament. It's one of the reasons that we can intuitively grasp, to a certain extent, the interior life of the Trinity. That there's a lover, there's a beloved, and then there's a love that's between them, because we see that in marriages. And we can see that in a good marriage, we can see that, and we can sort of raise that up and say, okay, God's even better than that, right? Because we're sort of an echo of that here. So entering into a sacramental marriage is a call to be an example of love and the constancy of God. So the outward sign of the sacrament is I'll use Chris again as the example because he just did it on Saturday. The public proclamation that you made on Saturday of steadfast love between you and Cassandra, that public proclamation during your wedding vows was part of the sign of the sacrament of holy matrimony. And then the continuing, ongoing love and commitment that you have for the next several decades is an ongoing sign that just keeps giving. It's a continuing sign for decades to come. Now, does it sound like a stretch to say that we humans are a sign pointing to God? Does it sound like a stretch? Because we're so imperfect. In the Old Testament, God the Father is very often described as wedding his people. That theme of a marriage bond between God and his people happens all throughout the Old Testament. It's sacred. It's a sign of covenant. It's a sign of a family bond. And it's a description of the desire for an unbreakable bond between God and his people. That idea of the wedding bond. In the New Testament, Jesus is very often described as the bridegroom. Have you ever heard Jesus described as the bridegroom? Who's the bride then? The church, all of us, right? So, and as a matter of fact, the very first of Christ's miracles in the Gospel of John is what? Turning water into wine where? At the wedding feast. Now, in a very interesting way, Jesus is revealing himself to be the bridegroom, because back then, the bridegroom is the one that's responsible for bringing wine to the wedding feast. So in a very interesting way, he's revealing himself as the bridegroom. So it's just kind of fun. And it goes on to Revelation, where there's the wedding feast of the Lamb, etc. Now we get into, and I gotta do this relatively quickly. I'd love to spend like 40 minutes on this next passage, because when I taught the Ephesians course, I did spend 40 minutes on this next passage. As it turns out, I'm gonna spend like about 5 minutes on it. So it's going to be really short. I'm going to just try and hit the highlights. But If anybody's interested, let me know. I'll send you the link to the longer version because it's really cool. One of my favorite passages is from Ephesians chapter 5, the second half of Ephesians chapter 5, and it's one of the most misunderstood passages in the entire Bible. One of the reasons it's misunderstood is some people, for political reasons, like to turn people away from God by pointing out something and saying, look, God's sexist, God's misogynistic, St. Paul is anti-woman and stuff like that. It can't be further from the truth. The message here is actually quite simple. The husband-wife relationship is meant to be an echo of the relationship between Christ and his church, which we've sort of touched upon already. And I did that so that we'd lead into this with sort of knowing this, so it shouldn't be that much of a surprise. So in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, where this passage starts, St. Paul says, be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. And he's talking to husbands and wives here. This whole section is St. Paul talking to husbands and wives. And he's specifically talking to Christian husbands and wives. In order to recognize the fact that husbands and wives are meant to be an echo of the relationship between Christ and his church, you need to be Christian to understand what that relationship is between Christ and his church. So you couldn't really take this and hand it to a pagan audience and say this helps you, because it wouldn't. Okay? But to Christian husbands and wives, this makes sense. So be subordinate to one another out of reverence to Christ. What does subordinate mean? We're going to go off on math here for just a second. I'm a math and science guy, so you know what the counting numbers are, the cardinal numbers, right? The cardinal numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, right? We know that 1, 2, 3, 4, real easy. We count stuff with the counting numbers, with the cardinal numbers. But what are ordinal numbers? Subordinate. What are ordinal numbers? First, second, third, fourth. So it's the place, it's the rank, it's the position of things, right? So you're not counting with those numbers. You're saying what order, what position, what's the rank of people. So the ordinal numbers subordinate. The ordinal numbers say, are you first, second, third, fourth? So St. Paul here is saying, husbands and wives, be subordinate to one another. What does that mean? To subordinate yourself means to voluntarily place yourself in a lower position than your spouse. To basically put yourself in a position of service to your spouse. That's what St. Paul is saying. So, and notice he's saying be subordinate to one another. Now, I'm a logical guy. I have a hard time with that one because how do you do that? Okay, I'm not going to say I'm first and first. I'm going to say I'm second because you're first. Well, if you say you're second, well, I got to be third. Well, okay, if you're third, then I got to be. You can go on forever. Okay, but you understand the concept, right? You can't just do it numerically, but you understand the concept. You're placing yourself in a position of service to the other person, and as long as you say be subordinate to one another, everything's fine. But then St. Paul goes from here where he's talking to both of them, and he spends 2 or 3 verses talking to the wife, and then he spends more verses talking to the husband. Guys, we're going to get beat up here in a second, so just get ready for it. But for the first couple of verses, he talks to the wife. And St. Paul repeats this, be subordinate to one another, but he refers specifically to the wife. So he says, wives, be subordinate to your husbands. And everybody goes, whoa! But it's the same thing as this. Right? Be subordinate to one another. If you're talking to a wife, it means be subordinate to your husband. If you're talking to the husband, you're saying be subordinate to your wife. You get that, right? So he's basically repeating the same thing. He just all of a sudden he says it to the wife, and everybody freaks out, or not everybody, but people that want to pick at and say that the Bible is patriarchal and anti-woman and all that kind of stuff. They pick on that verse and completely forget the verse that was just before it, which gets at my goat. Have you noticed? So he says that, and then he continues on and says, on Ephesians 5:23, he says, for the husband is head of his wife. Another one where you can pick on that, but it says, for the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is head of the church. If you start picking and choosing, it can sound bad, but if you take it in context, it says something beautiful. The husband is head of his wife, just as Christ is head of the church. Christ is the ultimate model of leadership. I'm hoping nobody in this room disagrees with me on that. Christ is the ultimate model of leadership. How does Christ lead? Who washed the feet at the Last Supper? Christ. And this is and washing the feet of the guests in the house is typically reserved for the lowest servant in the house. That's the lowest job in the house. Christ washed the feet of the apostles. He often showed examples of servant leadership. And he taught that greatness in leadership is measured by service and sacrifice. There was a time when some of the apostles were saying, who's great, who's great, who's great? And he comes back and says, whoever wants to become great amongst you must be a servant. Must be a servant. That is what leadership is. That's what being head is. Husband is head of his wife, just as Christ is head of the church. We get this wrong because our modern culture likes to teach that cooperation is weakness and that leadership is only whoever's got the most power rather than who is of most service. But if we go to the greatest example of leadership that has ever been known, we know that leadership means to be of service. The evil people in this world have twisted the concept of leadership into something that it's not and has twisted it out of its true and proper meaning. But if we look at leadership the way Jesus taught it, then we know that being head means being head servant. This is what Paul is saying to the husbands. Be the head of the household as Christ was head of the church. Now, I'm going to only hit one more verse here. If we had time, I'd go through this whole passage. But I'm only going to hit one more verse. And this verse, a lot of men feel that this is the hardest verse in the entire Bible to live up to. And with that set up, guys, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and handed himself over for her. How did Christ love the church? Crucifix. He went to the cross. He sacrificed his life. Pope John Paul II has a beautiful line. He says, the essence of the love of a husband is to lay down his life for his bride. The essence of the love of a husband is to lay down his life for his bride. To love your wives just the same way as Christ loved the church and handed himself over in the ultimate form of sacrifice. Anytime you see that phrase, handed himself over, or something along those lines, it means to the cross, when you're looking at that in the New Testament. Now, most husbands, if you ask them, and this is part of the machismo that's in us, right? You ask them, would you run into a burning building to save your wife? Oh yeah, just give me the opportunity, man. Just let me at it. I'm ready to go. Will you put the dishes in the dishwasher? Oh, come on. For some reason, we're ready to do the ultimate in sacrifice, but the little things, we start to fall apart. And I count myself amongst this. And the reason we all chuckle is because we know all of this is true, right? How many of you men would be more than happy to run into a burning building to save everybody? How many of you put the dishes away in the dishwasher? Hey, that's good, that's good. Strangely, that was a different group of hands. That was really odd. Yeah, good. Are you applauding for the ones that are running to the burning building, the ones that are putting the dishes? Okay, the dishes. See where the priorities are. Okay. So let's take a look now that we've seen three of the many verses that are in this passage. Let's look at the parallel that St. Paul is trying to make here between Christ and his church and husband and wife. Christ cares for and loves the church, and through his total sacrifice, he protects and provides for her. The church, that's us, we see that care, that love, that sacrifice, and in response, entrust ourselves to his loving care. Right? The parallel is the husband cares for and loves his wife, and through his total sacrifice, protects and provides for her. The wife sees that care, that love, that sacrifice, and in response, entrusts herself to his loving care. Paul is telling husbands to sacrifice even your whole life for your wife. When a husband loves that way, it's really easy for the wife to entrust herself to your care. When a husband doesn't love that way, there's really nothing to entrust herself to. Guys, sorry, but this is the truth. This is part of what it means to lead, is to be someone that she has confidence in trusting herself to. Another way to say that is, Paul says, husbands, you should be ready to sacrifice your last slice of pizza willingly. And then he also says, wives, if he manages to do that, smile at him. Be happy and trust yourself to the fact that you'll eat, because he will sacrifice his last slice of pizza for you. We should both, husbands and wives, we should both be so confident in the love of our spouse that we are willing to entrust our lives to them. Paul says, subordinate yourself to one another because your life is safe in their hands. We should feel comfortable with that. In essence, Paul is saying, look at the world's ultimate love story, the God and his church, and now emulate that. Try and aim towards that perfection. Remember I said at the beginning, even if things aren't perfect in the marriages that are around you or in your own, we need to look at the ideal. We need to know what that is so that we know what to aim for, because you can't rise out of something if you don't know what to aim for. So look at the ultimate love story and aim towards that perfection. Marriage is about mutual respect. It's about love and becoming a superhero team. Marriage isn't about who's in charge, but there is a natural structure to it. Why? Because God made us male and female. We have different strengths, and together we form a cohesive whole. We complement one another. So we should revel in the fact that, wow, that person over there is different than me. That's frustrating. But it means that together we're stronger because we've got complementary strengths. Marriage is a husband and wife in an attitude of love, trusting each other and striving for each other's benefit. And that's the quick version of Ephesians 5. If you want to know more about that, I'll let you know what the link is. Let me know. Now, marriage creates... Okay, Father Gavin just walked in the room. I thought I had to be done by now, but I've still got another couple of minutes, so he's going to have to walk around in the back. Anyway, so marriage creates a covenant family bond. In Genesis chapter 2, which we've talked about a couple of times already, Adam says Eve is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. That's a line that's often read at weddings. May have been read at some of your weddings, because it sounds very poetic. But it's also a poetic way to say that we're family. We are family. As a matter of fact, elsewhere in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 29, and also in 2 Samuel, there are people who come together, and in order to identify the other person as family members, they say, "You are bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." That is how you identify family. So right there at the beginning, as the first marriage between Adam and Eve, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. That covenant creates a family bond. Because once we say I do, we enter into a covenant, and that creates the family bond. And because a sacramental marriage is a covenant, it's unbreakable. Goes back to the permanence. This is the difference between a civil marriage that happens at the courthouse and a sacramental marriage that happens in a church. The civil marriage is a contract. And because it's a contract, you can undo a contract with another contract. And that other contract is just a one-page thing that says this is a divorce. That's a second contract. But a sacramental marriage is a covenant, and it cannot be dissolved. There is no such thing as a Catholic divorce. It doesn't exist. Which then brings up the concept of annulments. Now, you all know, because you've been through this long of RCIA, you know that Catholics love using Latin words to describe things, and we love these, fancy Latin words. You think, well, annulment is just the Catholic way to say Catholic divorce. No. An annulment is not a Catholic divorce. They don't exist. An annulment cannot dissolve a valid sacramental marriage. What happens in order to go after, or to ask for an annulment, is they ask the church to investigate whether or not the husband and wife actually entered into a valid sacramental marriage, to make sure that all of the things were there. For instance, remember I said the free will, which was necessary. One of the characteristics of the sacrament is free will. And I gave you the example of what happens if the father of the bride is sitting there with a gun in the first row and the groom knows he's got to say yes. He entered into that sacrament invalidly. Therefore, the church would be able to say, this isn't a valid sacramental marriage. So therefore, that would be annulled. And it's a matter of, it declares that the marriage never took place. It's not saying that, oh, we found grounds to separate these two. We can't do that. If God has joined them, we have no power to separate. Even the church doesn't have the power to separate. But the church can look at all the facts and determine that they never entered into it in the first place. That one with the father of the bride having the gun in the first row is just an easy one to look at. So it means that you're not divorced if you get an annulment. It means you're single because you never got married. Now, if you've had children in the meantime, their status isn't affected because at the time they came into being, you were considered married. So they're not considered illegitimate or anything else like that. The marriage was considered valid at the time. In order to grant an annulment, the church needs to investigate and find some sort of defect in the sacrament. Someone wasn't truthful to their 3 questions. Somebody had a gun in the first row, something like that. Or some error in form. For instance, there wasn't a priest there. There weren't two witnesses. There's all sorts of different things. There's lots of stuff. I don't know all the answers. If anybody wants to know, ask me and I'll put you into touch with somebody who knows better than I do. They can be very complex, so I'm not an expert. But what if somebody wasn't truthful about whether or not they were free to choose? That's the example of the gun in the front row. But there's also a very subtle threat to free will. And that's what we call sliding into marriage. Let's say boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, boy and girl start being very intimate, then they move in together, then they share all their finances, then all of their friends are in common. Everything is just basically there, but they're not married yet. But everything about them is pretty much married. And then so they take the last 5% leap and say, well, let's get married. Everybody expects this of us. That would be sliding into marriage, meaning they didn't fully use their free will and think about what it would be like to come at this as 100% question. And especially, and this would interrupt that free will, because if one or the other one of them felt so trapped by the fact that they were so tied together that we share a place to live and that we share our finances and all the rest of this stuff, it would be so difficult to break apart, then they're not making the decision for the right reason. And so you see how it would compromise the free will. All of that kind of stuff plays into this. What if one of them wasn't truthful about whether or not they were going to be faithful? What if on the day, and see, I'm not going to use Chris now as an example. Aren't you happy for this? I'm not going to use you for this. But I just used you. No, I didn't. I'm not using it. But what if either the husband or the wife, on the day where they were asked, are you going to be faithful until death do you part? They were harboring a thing and say, I'm not going to be faithful. I'm going to say yes because that's what I'm supposed to do, but I'm not going to. That would be an example of an invalid marriage because they weren't planning on being faithful at the moment they entered into the sacrament. But what if on the day they got married, they did intend to be faithful, but then a few months go by or a couple of years go by and they were unfaithful? Does that mean that the sacrament is invalid? No, because they entered into the sacrament validly. Then something really bad happened, and they have to deal with it. But the sacrament is in there. So, what if one of them was untruthful about their intent to be lifelong, right? So they're there and they say, well, the church says it's going to have to be a lifelong commitment till death do us part. But I sort of believe the real world, the real world out there, the modern culture that says just be with it as long as it's fun. So I'm going to say yes to this, but I don't really intend it to be lifelong. Well, then you have a question of whether or not God blesses that marriage on that day because one of them is entering it into invalidly. But what if, after lying about it, it does grow into a lifelong marriage? What if then a few years go by, and decades go by, and 40 years go by, and they're in love more than anything. Did God bless the marriage on day one, or does he wait till 40 years have gone by to prove it? There's no time in God, so he knows that it's going to be a lifelong marriage on day one, so he'll bless it on day one. So there's all these different things. There's many different situations, and like I said, if you need help, let me know. And if you were married in a courthouse and you want to bring that marriage into the church, and what's called convalidating the marriage, bringing it into the church, inviting God into your marriage, and asking for all those blessings and all that grace, let me know, and I can guide you on how to do that. Last two things, pretty quick. The family unit is considered what's called the domestic church. Each family is a domestic church where the family practices the faith, where the parents pass on the faith to their children. There's a great line that says, "It is within holy families that children first learn the basic virtues of justice, charity, forgiveness, and generosity." It's a beautiful thing. It's where good citizens are formed. It's for the good of society. The family is the vital cell of society on which all of civilization depends. Last thing, grace. God recognizes that a lifelong commitment requires a lot of love, a lot of strength, a lot of sacrifice, and a lot of willingness to forgive the other party, because we're all imperfect and we're all gonna unintentionally hurt each other. So we need to be willing to forgive. And God also knows that the very concept of family is dramatically under attack in this modern culture that we have. So this is why God grants us a huge dose of sanctifying grace within a sacramental marriage. This grace helps us to love as God loves, to forgive as God forgives, and to sacrifice for one another the same way God sacrificed for us. In short, it helps us to be saints for one another. Holy matrimony is one of the two sacraments of service. Who remembers what the other sacrament of service is? Holy orders, right. So 3 weeks ago, Father Breeze was in talking about holy orders. These are men who dedicate themselves as to service for others for their entire lives. That's one of the things that holy matrimony is about. Dedicating yourself to be of service to your spouse for the rest of your life. Dedicating yourself to be of service to your kids, and by extension to the rest of the community. So we're meant to be a light to the world. We're meant to be of service to one another. And Lucy loves this next line. She says it every once in a while, and she loves it. It comes from Father John Ricardo, but she sort of adopted it as her own motto. He says, "Sacrifice is always tedious and irksome." That's just what sacrifice is. But love can make it bearable. And perfect love can make it a joy. I pray that each of you, whether you are married or single, receive an abundance of God's grace so that you can approach perfection in love. Thanks for listening. God bless you. God bless our country, and God bless the church all throughout the world.